businessman almost lost $1 million deal in Russian until a boy stepped in and translated perfectly. David Miller was sweating bullets as he watched the Russian investor gesture angrily, speaking incomprehensible words and pointing at the papers scattered across the table. After 15 years building his small handmade furniture factory in Grand Rapids, Michigan, he was minutes away from losing everything because the hired translator simply hadn't shown up. The Russian, a burly man around 50, began gathering the documents into his brown leather briefcase, clearly frustrated with the situation. David felt desperation rising in his chest. This deal was his only chance to save his business from imminent bankruptcy. That's when a blonde boy with round glasses, no older than 12, appeared at the door of the meeting room in the small inn where the encounter was taking place. "Excuse me, gentlemen, do you need help?" the boy asked, adjusting his glasses as he curiously eyed the papers on the table. David was about to dismiss the child when the boy continued speaking, now in fluent Russian, addressing the investor directly. The man immediately stopped packing his documents, his eyes widening in surprise. An animated conversation began between them, with the boy translating simultaneously into English. "He says he's very interested in investing in your factory, Mr. Miller," the boy explained, his voice carrying surprising maturity. "But he was frustrated because he couldn't communicate properly. He wants to offer double the amount you were expecting." David's heart raced. Double meant not just saving the factory, but also expanding operations and rehiring the employees he'd been forced to let go in recent months. But something felt off about the whole situation. "How do you know Russian, kid?" David asked, still suspicious. "My name is Ethan Thompson," the boy replied, extending his hand formally. "My grandmother Margaret taught me when I was little. She came from Europe after the war and always said languages open doors." The Russian investor, introduced as Sergei Ivanov, continued speaking excitedly with Ethan, who translated every word with impressive precision. However, as the conversation progressed, David noticed a peculiar condition in the deal. "Mr. Sergei has a specific request," Ethan explained, nervously adjusting his glasses. "He wants all the former employees kept on, especially one particular cleaning lady. He insists on meeting her before signing anything." David was baffled. How would a Russian investor know about Mrs. Margaret, the 62-year-old woman who had handled cleaning at the factory for over a decade? She was one of the few employees he hadn't laid off, mostly out of pity. The woman had no family and relied entirely on the job. "But why this specific employee?" David questioned. Ethan translated the question and listened intently to Sergei's response, his expression shifting as the words reached him. "He says it's a very personal matter, that he's been searching for this woman for many years." Ethan paused, clearly moved by what he was hearing. "It seems she saved his daughter's life a long time ago." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. The atmosphere in the small meeting room grew thick with emotion. Sergei kept speaking in Russian, gesturing with his hands as tears welled in his eyes. Ethan translated every word, his own voice trembling. He tells how 25 years ago, when he was young and working temporarily in the United States, he hired an American nanny to care for his young daughter. One day, the girl fell into the pool and nearly drowned. The nanny jumped in and saved the child, but then disappeared without explanation. He never got to properly thank her. David felt a shiver run down his spine. The description matched perfectly with fragments of the personal story Mrs. Margaret had shared over the years, a difficult time in her life when she worked for wealthy families, an accident that made her flee the job out of fear. "I'll go get Mrs. Margaret," said David, rising from his chair. "She's here at the factory organizing some things for the possible move." While David went to find the employee, Ethan stayed in the room talking with Sergei. The boy showed surprising knowledge not only of Russian, but also technical details about woodworking that impressed the investor. "How do you know so much about furniture?" Sergei asked in Russian, and Ethan answered fluently. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years and always watched Mr. David's factory. My dream is to work with wood when I grow up. I've even sketched some furniture improvements." Ethan paused, then added shyly, "But my mum says that's for rich folks, that poor boys should keep their dreams small." Sergei was moved by the boy's sincerity and asked to see the sketches. Ethan hesitated before opening his worn-out school backpack, revealing dozens of detailed drawings on plain paper. The sketches showed creative modifications to the factory's furniture designs, some truly brilliant. Meanwhile, David found Mrs. Margaret in the factory warehouse, sorting tools into boxes. The woman, her graying hair tied in a simple bun and her hands calloused from work, was clearly worried about the future. "Mrs. Margaret, I need you to come with me. There's an investor who wants to meet you," said David, trying to keep his voice calm. "Me? Why would someone important want to meet me?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I haven't done anything wrong, Mr. David. I've always been honest in my work. It's nothing like that. In fact, this might be something very good for all of us." When they returned to the meeting room, Mrs. Margaret froze at the door upon seeing Sergei. Her face turned pale as paper, and she tried to step back, but David gently held her arm. "It can't be," she murmured in English, her hands visibly trembling. Sergei slowly rose from his chair, his eyes fixed on the woman. He began speaking in Russian, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan translated instantly, his words bridging two worlds that had been trying to reunite for decades. "He says he's been looking for you for 25 years, that he never forgot what you did for his daughter. He wants to thank you and apologize for making you feel like you had to run away." Mrs. Margaret began to cry, covering her face with her hands. Between sobs, she started telling her side of the story, with Ethan translating for Sergei. "I was so scared," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought you'd blame me for the accident. The girl was so small, so innocent. When I saw her fall into the water, I didn't think, I just jumped. But afterward, I was afraid I'd be fired, accused of neglect." Sergei listened to every word translated by Ethan, nodding in understanding. When she finished, he stepped forward slowly and held out his hands in a gesture of peace. "You saved my Natasha," he said in broken English, clearly straining to speak directly. "You hero to me." The moment was interrupted by the abrupt arrival of Robert Johnson, David's minority partner in the factory. A 40-year-old man, always impeccably dressed, and with an ambition that often clashed with David's more human values. "David, what's going on here?" asked Robert, eyeing Ethan suspiciously. "Why is a child running a business meeting?" The tension in the room immediately rose. Ethan sensed the shift in the atmosphere and translated the situation for Sergei, who watched Robert with growing interest. "This is my partner, Robert Johnson," David explained, clearly uncomfortable. "Robert, this is Mr. Sergei Ivanov, our potential investor, and this young man, Ethan, is assisting us with translation." Robert forced a businesslike smile and extended his hand to Sergei, but immediately began questioning the ongoing deal. "I'm sure we can find terms more favorable for both sides," said Robert, completely ignoring Mrs. Margaret and Ethan. "Perhaps we can discuss restructuring to make the investment more profitable." Ethan faithfully translated Robert's words, and Sergei's expression began to change. The Russian investor asked a direct question, which Ethan translated with visible discomfort. He wants to know what kind of restructuring Mr. Robert has in mind. "Well," Robert said, perking up at the question, "we could significantly cut operational costs, starting with payroll. We've had employees for years who could be replaced with younger, more efficient people at lower salaries." David's face turned red with anger. The conversation was heading in a direction he'd never imagined. Mrs. Margaret, realizing she was being discussed as a cost to be cut, began discreetly moving toward the door. Ethan translated Robert's proposal to Sergei, whose expression grew visibly irritated. The Russian began speaking rapidly, gesturing indignantly, while Ethan translated with increasing nervousness. "Mr. Sergei is very displeased with this suggestion. He says he doesn't invest in companies that don't value their experienced employees. To him, loyalty and experience are worth more than saving a few dollars." Robert, realizing his mistake, tried to backtrack, but the damage was done. Sergei kept speaking, now addressing David directly through Ethan's translation. "He wants to know if you agree with your partner's ideas, if the company's philosophy is truly to discard people for immediate profits." David looked at Mrs. Margaret, who stood visibly shaken and frightened near the door. Then he glanced at Ethan, whose eyes shone with a wisdom beyond his years behind round glasses. Finally, he faced Robert, seeing for the first time how far their values had drifted. "No," David said firmly. "I don't agree. Our company was built on respect for the people who work with us. Mrs. Margaret is family, just like all the other employees we've had to let go temporarily." Robert was visibly annoyed by David's response, but tried to maintain his professional composure. "David, you're being sentimental. Business is business. If we want to grow, we have to make tough decisions." Ethan translated the discussion for Sergei, who listened with growing interest. Suddenly, the boy dropped his school backpack, spilling not just furniture sketches, but also notebooks and some books in Russian. Sergei bent down to help gather the items and was fascinated by the quality of Ethan's drawings. He began asking technical questions in Russian about the designs, and Ethan answered with knowledge that even impressed David. "How did you learn so much about woodworking?" David asked, genuinely curious. "My mother worked here for 2 years," replied Ethan, adjusting his glasses nervously. "I used to wait for her outside every day after school. I'd watch you all working through the window, ask the employees about the techniques, read everything I could find about furniture at the library." "His mother worked here?" asked Robert with an expression David couldn't decipher. "She did," Ethan answered, lowering his gaze. "Until you told Mr. David there were too many people in cleaning, and that costs needed to be cut." The silence that followed was deafening. David vaguely remembered the conversation with Robert about reducing staff, but he hadn't connected that decision to specific personal stories. Now, looking at Ethan, he realized how his business choices affected real families. "What's your mother's name?" David asked, already suspecting the answer. "Sarah Thompson," Ethan replied. "She still talks about you sometimes, says you were always kind to the employees, that it was a shame she had to leave." Sergei was listening to Ethan's translation with growing attention, his expression turning increasingly serious. He asked Robert a direct question through Ethan. He wants to know how many people were recently laid off and why. Robert hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "They were necessary decisions to keep the company viable. The market is tough. We needed to cut operational costs." Ethan translated, but Sergei followed up with another question that visibly unnerved Robert. He wants to see the financial records from the last 2 years. He wants to understand exactly where the money was spent. David realized he had never done a detailed audit of the expenses Robert controlled. As a minority partner, Robert mainly handled administrative and financial matters, while David focused on production and furniture quality. "Of course," David said, "we can pull all the documents." "Actually," Robert interrupted quickly, "it would be better to schedule a separate meeting for that. Today is just to discuss the general terms of the investment." Sergei said something in Russian that made Ethan's eyes widen. The boy hesitated before translating, clearly uncomfortable. He said honest businessmen aren't afraid to show their numbers. That transparency is essential for any serious partnership. The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Robert started visibly sweating, while David felt he was losing control of a situation that was already complicated enough. Then the door opened again, and a woman in her mid-30s hurried in, clearly looking for someone. "Ethan, I searched the whole school for you," she said, stopping abruptly when she saw the meeting in progress. "I'm sorry, She fell silent when she recognized David. Her eyes filled with tears and she lowered her head in a mix of shame and longing. "Mr. David," murmured Sarah, her voice choked. "I didn't know Ethan was here bothering you." "He's not bothering anyone, Sarah," David said, standing to greet her. "In fact, he's been a great help." Ethan rushed to his mother's side, quickly whispering an explanation of what was happening. Sarah listened with growing surprise, glancing between David, Sergei, and especially Robert. "Mom, the Russian gentleman wants to invest in the factory and bring back all the workers," Ethan said excitedly. "You could come back to work here." Sarah looked at Robert with an expression David couldn't fully interpret, but it seemed to hold more than just resentment for being let go. "I'm not sure that would be a good idea, my son," she said calmly. "Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past." Sergei, sensing something important was happening, asked Ethan to translate the conversation. When he learned that Sarah was a former employee who had been fired, he asked a series of direct questions about the circumstances of her departure. Ethan translated with growing discomfort, especially when Sergei specifically asked about the real reason for the dismissal and whether there had been more to it than just cost-cutting. Sarah hesitated for a long time before answering, glancing nervously at Robert, who was visibly agitated. "Tell him it was just cost-cutting," she finally replied, but her voice didn't sound convincing. Sergei didn't seem satisfied with the answer and kept asking questions. Ethan found himself at the center of an increasingly tense situation, translating questions that clearly touched on sensitive matters. It was then that David realized he needed to understand more about what had really happened with the layoffs. He had always trusted Robert's decisions on administrative matters, but now he was starting to wonder if there was more to the story. "Sarah," David said gently, "can you tell me exactly what happened when you were let go? I promise there won't be any consequences. I just want to understand." Sarah looked at Robert again, who was now clearly nervous. Ethan sensed the tension and translated the situation for Sergei, who watched everything with growing interest. "Mr. David," Sarah finally said, "I really need to go. Ethan, let's leave now." But Ethan didn't want to go. He was living a dream, helping with an important negotiation, talking about furniture and design with people who truly understood the subject. Besides, his childlike intuition told him there was more happening here than just a business meeting. "Mom, just a little longer," Ethan pleaded. "Mister, Sergei still wants to see my furniture sketches." Sergei, hearing his name, approached Ethan and began speaking in Russian. Ethan translated for everyone. "He's offering me a scholarship to learn professional woodworking. He says I have natural talent and wants to help me develop it." Sarah's face brightened momentarily before growing worried again. She glanced once more at Robert, who clearly wanted the whole situation to end quickly. "Ethan, we need to talk about this at home," she said. "Let's go now." But Sergei had noticed something in the interaction between Sarah and Robert. He asked a direct question through Ethan. "He wants to know if you're afraid of something or someone here." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Sergei's question created a tense silence in the room. Sarah looked directly at David, ignoring Robert for the first time since she had arrived. "Mr. David, you've always been a good boss, fair and honest, but sometimes the people closest to us aren't what they seem." "What do you mean by that?" David asked, a chill settling in his stomach. Robert cut in before Sarah could answer. "David, I think we're wasting time with personal matters. We should focus on the deal with Mr. Sergei." But Sergei wasn't interested in moving forward until he fully understood the situation. He spoke at length in Russian, and Ethan translated with a serious expression. He says that in Russia, he learned that business people who hide things from their partners can't be trusted. He wants everything cleared up before any agreement. David looked firmly at Sarah. "Please tell me what really happened. You have my word that there won't be any problems." Sarah took a deep breath, looked at Ethan with maternal love, and finally decided to speak. "I discovered some irregularities in the financial records. Expenses that didn't match actual purchases, suppliers that didn't exist, things like that. When I tried to talk to Mr. Robert about it, he said I was meddling where I didn't belong." David felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. Robert tried to interrupt, but Sarah continued. "The next day he told me I'd be laid off due to cost cutting, but he also made it clear that it would be better for me to stay quiet about what I'd seen, for the sake of my family." Ethan translated everything for Sergei, who listened with an increasingly serious expression. The Russian investor asked a direct question. "He wants to know if you kept any proof of these irregularities." "I kept some copies before being let go," admitted Sarah. "They're at home in case I ever needed to defend myself." Robert finally exploded. "This is absurd. These are baseless accusations from a resentful former employee. David, you're not going to believe this, are you?" David was in shock. For years, he'd completely trusted Robert to handle the administrative side of the business. He'd never imagined there could be dishonesty. "Robert, David said slowly. "Do you have any explanation for what Sarah is saying?" "Of course I do," Robert replied defensively. "She was mixing up the records, misinterpreting documents. When I tried to explain, she became hostile and started making accusations." Sergei asked another question through Ethan. "He wants to see the original documents Sarah mentioned. He says in Russia there's a saying, 'Paper endures anything, but numbers don't lie.'" Sarah hesitated, clearly afraid of the possible consequences, but Ethan encouraged her. "Mom, if what you saw was wrong, Mr. David needs to know. He doesn't deserve to be deceived." David was torn between loyalty to his longtime partner and the growing suspicion that he'd been betrayed. Sergei's presence made everything more complicated, a potential investor witnessing what might be the discovery of fraud in his own company. "Sarah," David said firmly, "I need to see those documents. I promise you'll be protected no matter what we find." "I'll bring them tomorrow," said Sarah. "They're at home, but I can get them tonight." "No," Sergei interrupted through Ethan. "We'll all go together now. I want to see everything today, before making any investment decision." The suggestion created a new dynamic in the room. Robert was visibly desperate, while David struggled to process the possibility that his business partner might have deceived him for years. "Robert," David said, "are you willing to come with us and clear this up?" "This is ridiculous, David. You're letting a resentful ex-employee destroy our partnership." Sergei said something in Russian that made Ethan blush slightly before translating. He said a Russian expression that, well, basically means guilty men always shout louder than innocent ones. The situation was quickly turning into something none of them had anticipated. What began as a business meeting was becoming an investigation into the company's very integrity. Mrs. Margaret, who had remained silent in the corner of the room throughout the discussion, finally spoke up. "Mr. David, in all these years working here, I've always known you to be an honest man. But I've also always found it strange how the accounts sometimes didn't match what I saw being delivered to the factory." Her words were another blow to David. If even Mrs. Margaret had noticed inconsistencies, how had he been so blind? "What kind of things did you notice, Mrs. Margaret?" asked David. "Well, sometimes invoices would arrive for materials I never saw being unloaded. Or only a few materials would come in, but the invoices were for large quantities. I always thought maybe I was mixing up the dates or something." Ethan translated everything for Sergei, who nodded in understanding. The Russian investor seemed to be piecing together a mental puzzle with all the information he was receiving. Robert tried one last move. "David, if you take this further, you'll destroy our company. Even if nothing's wrong, the mere suspicion will scare off other investors. You're throwing away years of work over paranoia." But David had already made up his mind. He looked at Ethan, whose eyes shone with a mix of fear and admiration at being in the middle of such a grown-up and important situation. "Ethan," said David, "ask Mr. Sergei if he'd be willing to wait for this situation to be resolved before making any decisions about the investment." Ethan translated, and Sergei responded at length. His answer surprised everyone. He says he's more interested in investing now than before. That business owners who face problems head-on, even when it's hard, are the kind of partners he looks for. But he wants everything cleared up before signing anything. Sergei's response gave David the courage he needed to move forward. He turned to Sarah. "Let's go get those documents now. I want this settled today." "David, you're making a terrible mistake," said Robert, his voice now clearly desperate. "If I'm making a mistake," David replied, "at least it'll be an honest one." The group prepared to leave the inn's meeting room. Ethan carefully packed his drawings into his backpack. Mrs. Margaret straightened her apron. Sarah took a deep breath, bracing herself for a moment that would change everything, and Sergei watched it all with the patience of someone who'd seen many complicated situations in his years of business. Robert hesitated at the door, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he decided to join the group, perhaps still hoping to control the damage or find a way to explain the irregularities. Sarah's house was just 10 minutes from the inn, in a simple but well-kept working-class neighborhood. Along the way, Ethan kept talking to Sergei in Russian, occasionally translating comments about the city, the weather, and the quality of the furniture they saw in the shops. "Mom," Ethan said as they walked. "Do you think I did the right thing by telling everything?" "You did more than right, my son," Sarah replied, squeezing the boy's hand. "Sometimes it takes courage to do what's right, even when it's scary." Sergei listened to Ethan's translation and made a remark that deeply moved Sarah. He said you should be proud of raising such a brave and honest son, that children like him are the hope for the future. When they reached Sarah's small house, she invited them into the simple but cozy living room. The walls were decorated with some of Ethan's drawings and family photos. Sergei observed everything with interest, especially the furniture sketches Ethan had made over the years. "Are all these drawings yours, Ethan?" asked David, impressed by the quantity and quality of the work. "Yes, sir. I drew whenever I had free time. I'd look at the factory furniture and imagine how it could be improved or changed." Sarah went to a small cabinet in the bedroom and returned with a folder containing several sheets and photocopies. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handed the documents to David. "I made copies before leaving the factory," she explained. "I didn't know if I'd ever need them, but I felt I should keep them." David began examining the papers with growing concern. The documents showed clear discrepancies between recorded purchases and materials actually received. There were invoices from suppliers he didn't recognize, amounts that didn't match the approved budget, and a series of other irregularities. Sergei asked Ethan to translate the main documents, and as he listened to the explanations, his expression grew increasingly serious. "Robert," said David, his voice controlled but clearly shaken, "how do you explain this?" Robert looked at the documents for a few moments, his face shifting through several different expressions. Finally, he seemed to accept that there was no way to deny the facts anymore. "David, things aren't as simple as they seem," he began. "The company was in serious financial trouble. I tried some maneuvers to keep everything running." "What kind of maneuvers?" asked David, though he already suspected the answer. "Inflating some purchases, contracts with shell companies, small diversions here and there. Nothing that would permanently harm the company. It was just to get through a tough time." The silence that followed was devastating. Ethan automatically translated for Sergei, who listened while shaking his head in disapproval. "How long has this been going on?" asked David. "About 3 years," admitted Robert, "but always with the intention of paying everything back when the situation improved." Sarah began to cry silently. Ethan moved closer to his mother, wrapping his arm around her in a protective gesture that deeply moved everyone present. 3 years, repeated David, the reality of the betrayal finally sinking in. 3 years of lies, forged documents, stealing from our own company. Sergei asked a question through Ethan. "He wants to know the total amount involved in these irregularities." Robert hesitated before answering. "It's hard to calculate exactly. Maybe around $200,000 over time." The number was devastating. For a small company like theirs, $200,000 represented a huge sum, enough to explain many of the financial struggles they'd faced in recent years. David sank heavily into one of Sarah's kitchen chairs, burying his head in his hands. His entire life's work seemed to be crumbling at once. "David," said Robert, trying to step closer, "I can pay it all back. We can handle this between us, without involving anyone else." "How?" asked David, lifting his head. "How are you going to return $200,000 that's already been spent? And more importantly, how can I ever trust you again?" Sergei observed the entire situation with the experience of someone who had been through many complicated negotiations. He made a remark to Ethan that surprised everyone. He says situations like this, though painful, are sometimes necessary to clear the path for better things, that he'd rather uncover problems before becoming a partner than after. Sergei's statement brought a small glimmer of hope to David. Even in the midst of chaos, the Russian investor was still considering the deal. "Mr. Sergei," David said through Ethan, "I completely understand if you want to cancel our agreement. This situation is embarrassing and complicated." Sergei responded at length, and Ethan translated with growing excitement. "He says he still wants to make the investment, but under different conditions. He wants Mr. Robert removed from the partnership and all unfairly dismissed employees rehired. He also wants to implement a system of total financial transparency." David looked at Robert, who was visibly desperate. "Robert, you have two options," said David firmly. "You can leave the partnership voluntarily, and we can work together to minimize the damage, or I can take legal action to protect the company." "David, please," begged Robert. "We can find a solution that works for everyone." "The solution that works for everyone," interrupted Sergei through Ethan, "is for you to take responsibility for your actions and let honest people rebuild this company." Mrs. Margaret, who had remained silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Mr. David, all these years, I've always known you were a good man. Now I see you're also a brave one." Ethan translated Mrs. Margaret's words for Sergei, who smiled for the first time since arriving in the United States. "Mom," Ethan said to Sarah, "do you think everything will be all right now?" "I think so, my son," she replied, smiling through her tears. "Sometimes you have to weather the storm to reach the sunshine." Sergei listened to the translation and made a remark that moved everyone. He said there's a Russian proverb, "After the harshest winter, always comes the most beautiful spring." He thinks it applies to our situation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The afternoon was growing late when the group returned to David's furniture factory. Robert had reluctantly agreed to cooperate with transferring his share of the company, though he still tried to negotiate better terms for himself. "Ethan," David said as they walked through the factory warehouse, "would you like to see how furniture is really made?" The boy's eyes sparkled behind his round glasses. He had dreamed of this moment for years, watching from afar through the windows. "Really, Mr. David?" "Of course. In fact, I have a proposal for you and your mother." Sergei watched everything with growing interest. The factory, though small, was well organized, and the furniture had a craftsmanship quality that impressed him. He made several positive remarks, which Ethan translated with obvious pride. "He says he rarely sees furniture made with such care and attention to detail," Ethan translated, "that this is exactly the kind of business he likes to invest in." David felt a wave of relief. Despite all the trouble with Robert, his life's work still had value and recognition. "Sarah," David said, turning to Ethan's mother, "I'd like you to come back to work here, but not just cleaning. I want you to oversee financial and administrative control." Sarah looked at David in surprise. "Mr. David, I don't have the qualifications for that. I only finished high school." "You have something far more valuable than a diploma," David replied. "You have honesty and an eye for detail. And after what happened, I need someone I can trust completely." Sergei, hearing the translation, made a suggestion that surprised everyone. "He's offering to pay for a business course for you," Ethan translated for his mother. "He says investing in people's education is investing in the company's future." Sarah began to cry again, this time from joy and gratitude. Ethan rushed to hug his mother, overwhelmed by the opportunities opening up for them both. "And you, Ethan," David continued, "if your parents agree, I'd like you to come here after school in the afternoons. You can learn woodworking from me and the other experienced craftsmen." "Really?" Ethan asked, hardly believing his ears. "Really. And Mr. Sergei is offering a scholarship that will cover your education through college if you stay interested in working with furniture." Sergei spoke directly to Ethan in Russian, and the boy responded at length. The conversation seemed emotional for both. "What were you talking about?" asked David. "He was telling me about design schools in Russia," explained Ethan. "He said if I want, after finishing high school, I can do an exchange program there to learn advanced woodworking and furniture design techniques." Sergei's generosity was impressing everyone. Mrs. Margaret approached the Russian investor and said something that needed no translation to be understood. "Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." Sergei understood perfectly and replied in broken English, "Good family deserves good things." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of other factory workers who had been called by David for an important meeting. There were 5 people who had worked at the company for years before being laid off in recent cuts. "Everyone," said David, gathering them all, "I have good news. You're all rehired, with better salaries than before." The joy on the workers' faces was visible. Some cried, others applauded, and everyone wanted to know how this had been possible. David briefly explained Sergei's investment and the discovery of the issues with Robert. Ethan helped translate parts of the explanation for the Russian investor. "But there are conditions," David continued. "We'll implement a new system of full transparency. All expenses will be recorded and verified by at least 2 people, and we'll work together to rebuild our company on stronger foundations." Sergei gave a speech in Russian that Ethan translated emotionally. He said he believes family businesses where people care for each other are the future of commerce, that he's honored to be part of this family. One of the oldest workers, Frank, 62, approached Ethan. "Son, I heard you were the one who saved our company today. How can we thank you?" Ethan blushed and nervously adjusted his glasses. "I just translated what people wanted to say, but I think we all saved the company together." Sergei observed the interaction and made a remark that deeply moved David. He said he rarely sees such wisdom in someone so young, that Ethan will be a natural leader in the future. As the afternoon turned to evening, the details of the new agreement were finalized. Sergei would invest an amount that would not only save the company, but allow for significant expansion. Robert would be removed from the partnership and required to repay the embezzled funds through a supervised payment plan. "Ethan," said Sergei in English, struggling to communicate directly, how to say hero today?" "I'm not a hero," Ethan replied humbly. "I just did what I thought was right." "That's why you hero," Sergei insisted, smiling. Sarah watched her son interact with important adults, seeing in him a maturity and wisdom that made her proud, yet concerned. Ethan was still a child, but he had shown qualities of character many adults lacked. "Mr. David," said Sarah, "may I ask a question?" "Of course, Sarah." "Why are you being so generous with us?" Ethan only translated a few conversations, nothing more. David thought for a moment before answering. "You know, Sarah, for a long time I focused only on the technical aspects of business. I forgot a company is made of people, not just machines and profits. Ethan reminded me of that today. He showed me honesty and courage are more valuable than any technical skill." Sergei, listening to the translation, nodded emphatically. "In Russia, we say, gold can be stolen, but character lasts forever." Mrs. Margaret, who had been following the unfolding events with growing interest, approached Sergei. "Mr. Sergei, may I ask a personal question?" Ethan translated, and Sergei nodded in agreement. "How is your daughter now? The little girl I helped so many years ago?" Sergei smiled broadly and pulled out a photo from his wallet. He showed the image of a beautiful young woman, about 25 years old, who had graduated from medical school. "Natasha, a doctor now," he said in English, "saves lives, just like you saved hers." Mrs. Margaret began to cry as she looked at the photo. 25 years of guilt and fear dissolved in that moment. "She turned out okay," murmured Mrs. Margaret. "She grew up and turned out okay." "She wants to meet you," said Ethan, translating Sergei's words. "When she found out I had met you, she said she wants to come to the United States to thank you in person." The revelation that Sergei's daughter wanted to meet Mrs. Margaret added a new emotional layer to the whole situation. What had started as a business meeting had turned into a series of profound human reconnections. "Ethan," said David, "do you realize that today you not only saved my company, but also brought together people who needed to find each other again?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "I think sometimes things happen for reasons we don't fully understand. I just wanted to help, but it seems like everything was connected somehow." Sergei made a remark that Ethan translated with a smile. He said that in Russia, we believe the universe conspires to bring together people who need to be together. That today was proof of that. As the evening progressed, the practical details of the deal were finalized. Sergei would stay in the United States for 2 more weeks to oversee the first steps of the company's restructuring. Ethan would have Russian lessons 3 times a week with Sergei, in addition to starting his hands-on apprenticeship in woodworking. "Mom," Ethan said to Sarah. "Do you think Dad would be proud of me today?" Sarah hugged her son emotionally. Ethan's father had passed away when the boy was just 8 years old, and since then Sarah had raised him alone, always striving to instill in him the values his father would have wanted him to have. "Your father would be more than proud," she replied. "He always said you were special, that your heart was too big for your small body." Sergei, even without fully understanding English, sensed the emotion of the moment and made a kind remark. "Ethan's father. Proud? Heaven," he said in broken English, pointing upward. The simplicity and sincerity of Sergei's words deeply moved Sarah and Ethan. It was clear the Russian investor wasn't just a businessman, but someone who understood the importance of family bonds and human values. "Mr. Sergei," said Ethan, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Ethan. Why did you decide to invest in our company? There are many bigger and more organized businesses out there." Sergei thought carefully before answering, wanting to convey exactly what he felt. "Ethan, in Russia I have many big businesses, lots of money, lots of profit, but not much." He paused, searching for the right word. "Heart. Here, today, I see a company with heart. People who care for each other. That's worth more than all the profits." Sergei's answer revealed much about his own personal journey. Despite all his financial success, he was searching for something deeper and more meaningful in his investments. David, listening to Sergei's words, felt profound gratitude, not just for the financial rescue of his company, but for the lesson about what truly mattered in business and in life. "Mr. Sergei," said David, "I promise we'll live up to your trust. Let's build not just a profitable business, but a true business family." "That's all I want," replied Sergei, smiling. When the time finally came to say goodbye for the day, the air held a completely different energy. What had begun as desperation and fear had transformed into hope and possibility. Ethan carefully tucked his sketches into his backpack, but this time with the certainty that they represented the beginning of a real future, not just distant dreams. "Mum," he said as they walked home, "today was the best day of my life." "Mine too, son," Sarah replied. "Mine too." Behind them, David and Sergei continued discussing the next steps, with Mrs. Margaret walking alongside them. The 62-year-old woman seemed to have regained an energy she hadn't shown in years, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Mr. David," Mrs. Margaret said, "can I keep doing the cleaning too? Even with all these changes, I like keeping everything organized." "Of course, Mrs. Margaret, but now you'll be much more than a cleaning employee. You'll be our cultural ambassador, especially when Mr. Sergei's daughter comes to visit." The idea of having a special role in the company, along with the possibility of finally meeting the girl she had saved so many years ago, left Mrs. Margaret visibly emotional. "Ethan," David called before the boy got too far. "Don't forget, tomorrow at 4 you have your first woodworking lesson." Ethan waved enthusiastically, barely able to contain his excitement. Finally, his dreams were coming true in a way he had never imagined possible. That night, in their respective homes, each person involved in the day's events reflected on how a single afternoon had completely changed their lives. David lay in bed thinking about how he had nearly lost his business to a dishonest partner, but had instead found true allies. Sarah fell asleep grateful to see her son recognized and valued the way she always knew he deserved. Ethan, in his bed, flipped through his furniture sketches with a whole new perspective. They were no longer just the doodles of a dreamy boy, but the first designs of a future furniture maker. And Mrs. Margaret, for the first time in 25 years, slept without the weight of guilt on her shoulders. Sergei, in his room at the inn, called his daughter Natasha in Russia to tell her about the day's events. The conversation, which lasted over an hour, was filled with emotion as he described reuniting with the woman who had saved his life. "Papa," Natasha said over the phone, "I need to meet this woman. She changed our lives forever." "You'll come to the United States soon," Sergei promised, "and you'll see that sometimes miracles happen when we least expect them." The following days were a whirlwind of activity at the furniture factory. Robert fulfilled his part of the agreement, transferring his shares in the company and setting up a repayment plan for the embezzled money. Though resentful, he admitted he had no choice given the evidence presented. Ethan began his woodworking lessons with contagious enthusiasm. His ability to learn was impressive, and soon he was crafting small pieces that even the most experienced workers found surprising. "Mr. David," Frank said, watching Ethan work, "this boy has the golden touch. In 6 months, he'll be making better furniture than most adults out there." Sarah quickly adapted to her new administrative responsibilities. Her attention to detail and natural honesty soon brought an organization the company had never experienced before. Sergei stayed true to his word, remaining in the United States to personally oversee the first steps of the restructuring. His Russian lessons with Ethan became lively sessions where they discussed not only language, but also design, business, and life philosophy. "Ethan," Sergei said during one of their lessons, "you understand that talent without character is worthless, right?" "I do, Mr. Sergei," Ethan replied in Russian, his grasp of the language improving quickly. "My mother always taught me that being smart doesn't matter if you're not honest." "Your mother is a wise woman," Sergei agreed. 2 weeks after the initial meeting, the day came for Sergei's return to Russia. But before leaving, he had one final surprise for everyone. "I have a special announcement," he said in English, gathering everyone at the factory. Ethan translated simultaneously to ensure everyone understood perfectly. "Natasha, my daughter, is coming to the United States in a month. She wants to meet Mrs. Margaret and see the company that will be her partner." "Partner?" David asked, confused. Ethan translated Sergei's explanation. "He's saying Natasha wants to open a rehabilitation clinic here in the United States and would like to use specialized furniture made by us. It would be a partnership between her clinic and our factory." The news was met with widespread excitement. Not only did it mean more business for the company, but also the chance to create products that would genuinely help people in recovery. "And Ethan," Sergei continued, "Natasha wants to meet the boy who helped reunite the woman who saved her life." Ethan blushed at the attention, but was clearly thrilled at the prospect of meeting Sergei's daughter and discussing medical furniture design with her. "Mr. Sergei," Mrs. Margaret said, tears in her eyes, "after all these years, I'll finally be able to hug that girl and tell her how sorry I am for the scare she went through." "Mrs. Margaret," Sergei replied, taking her hands, "you don't need to apologize. You saved the life most precious to me. Natasha is a doctor today because you gave her the chance to grow." The farewell moment was emotional for everyone. Sergei had become more than an investor. He was now part of the extended family that had formed around the small furniture factory. "Ethan," Sergei said, hugging the boy, "keep studying, keep designing, keep being the honest young man you are. In 3 years, when you finish high school, you'll come to Russia to learn advanced techniques." "I promise I won't let you down, sir," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You could never let me down," Sergei said. "You have a pure heart. That's all that matters." The following month passed quickly. The company thrived under the new transparent management. Ethan made impressive progress in both woodworking and Russian, and everyone eagerly awaited Natasha's arrival. When the day finally came, Ethan was especially nervous. He had prepared some small furniture pieces as welcome gifts and practiced presentations in Russian to impress Sergei's daughter. "Mom," he said while getting ready for the airport, "do you think she'll like the furniture I made?" "I'm sure she will, son," Sarah replied, "but remember, the most important thing is that she'll meet the brave boy who helped bring our family back together." Natasha arrived in the United States, accompanied by a small medical team that would help her establish the rehabilitation clinic. She was a beautiful young woman of 25, with the same intensity in her eyes as her father, but with a special kindness that came from her medical training. The reunion between Natasha and Mrs. Margaret was one of the most touching moments anyone present had ever witnessed. 2 generations embraced, finally closing a circle that had remained open for 25 years. "You saved my life," said Natasha in English, surprising everyone with her command of the language. "And now I save other people's lives. It's all because of you." Mrs. Margaret wept uncontrollably, finally freeing herself from decades of guilt and fear. Ethan translated simultaneously for those who didn't understand English, moved to be part of such a meaningful moment. "Ethan," said Natasha, turning to the boy, "my father told me all about you. I want to see the furniture you designed for the clinic." Ethan proudly showed his rehabilitation furniture designs, special chairs for exercises, adjustable therapy tables, equipment adapted for different needs. Natasha was impressed by the maturity and sensitivity of the designs. "These designs are truly special," she said. "They show you understand not just furniture, but people. That's rare in designers so young." Natasha's approval meant a lot to Ethan. She represented not only his mentor's daughter, but a qualified professional who could objectively evaluate his work. In the following days, Natasha worked with the factory team to develop the specialized furniture her clinic would need. Ethan actively participated in the process, contributing ideas that impressed both the adults and Natasha herself. "David," Natasha said during one of the planning meetings, "you have a treasure in this boy. Ethan isn't just talented, he has the sensitivity to understand people's needs. That will make him an extraordinary designer." The partnership between Natasha's clinic and David's factory grew quickly. They created a specialized line of medical furniture that soon caught the attention of other clinics and hospitals in the region. Ethan became essential in the design process, working directly with Natasha to understand the specific needs of rehabilitation patients. His innovative ideas and human-centered approach made the furniture a benchmark in the field. "You know," Natasha told Ethan during one of their work sessions, "when my father told me about the boy who translated for him, I imagined just a smart kid who knew Russian. I never thought I'd find a future professional partner." "Professional partner?" asked Ethan, his eyes widening behind his glasses. "I want you to be my official consultant for medical furniture design," Natasha explained. "Of course, you're still young and need to keep studying, but you can already start contributing ideas and designs." Natasha's offer represented professional recognition Ethan had never dreamed possible at his age. Sarah, who was listening to the conversation, was moved to see her son valued so meaningfully. "My son," Sarah told Ethan that night, "your father would be so proud to see where your honesty and determination have taken you." "Mom," Ethan replied, "sometimes I think this is all a dream. A few months ago I was just watching the factory from afar, and now I'm designing furniture for a real clinic." "It's not a dream, my love," said Sarah, kissing her son's forehead. "It's the result of you always doing what's right, even when it's hard." 6 months after that first meeting in the inn's conference room, David's furniture factory had completely transformed, not just financially, but in purpose and vision. The medical furniture line had become a success, creating jobs for dozens of people in the community. Ethan continued to develop his talents, now as an official consultant for Natasha's clinic, while preparing for his future exchange program in Russia. Mrs. Margaret had become a sort of cultural ambassador between the company's US and Russian operations, helping to facilitate communications and ensuring human values remained at the heart of all business decisions. Sarah thrived in her new administrative role, having become indispensable to the company's financial organization. She had also begun her business administration course, sponsored by Sergei, proving to herself that it was never too late to learn and grow. David, reflecting on all the events, realized how the near loss of his company had turned into the greatest blessing of his professional life. He had learned that true success wasn't measured just in profits, but in the ability to create real value for people. "Ethan," David said one day, watching the boy work on a new design, "do you still remember that day when you walked into the meeting room and asked if we needed help?" "I do, Mr. David," Ethan replied, smiling. "Why do you ask?" "Because I realized it was you who needed help the most that day. I was lost, about to lose everything, and a 12-year-old boy showed me the way." Ethan stopped drawing and looked seriously at David. "Mr. David, I think we all needed help that day. I needed a chance. My mum needed a job. Mrs. Margaret needed peace. You needed honesty. And Mr. Sergei needed a real business family." The wisdom in Ethan's words continued to surprise everyone around him. Even as he grew rapidly in knowledge and skills, he maintained a humility and perspective that made him special. "And do you know what I've learned from all this?" Ethan continued. "What?" David asked. "That sometimes the best solutions come when we stop thinking only about ourselves and start thinking about how we can help each other." Ethan's reflection perfectly captured the spirit that had turned a business crisis into a story of renewal and human growth. As the first year of the partnership came to an end, Sergey returned to the United States for an evaluation visit. He was impressed not only by the financial results, but especially by the family-like atmosphere that had developed in the company. "Ethan," Sergey said during his visit, "are you ready to come to Russia to study advanced design?" "I still have 2 years left to finish high school," Ethan replied, "but I'm eager to learn everything I can." "Good," Sergey said, smiling. "Eagerness to learn is the most important quality for a student." During that visit, Sergey made an announcement that surprised everyone. He had decided to permanently establish a branch of his Russian companies in the United States, with David's furniture factory as the main base. "The United States is now my second home," he explained. "Here, I found a real family, not just business partners." Sergey's decision meant long-term stability for everyone involved, but also new responsibilities and growth opportunities. Ethan, now 13, had become a sort of cultural bridge between the US and Russian operations. His command of Russian was impressive, and his understanding of design continued to develop remarkably. "Natasha," Ethan said during a video call with the clinic, "I have an idea for a new kind of rehabilitation chair." "Let's hear it," Natasha replied, always interested in the young designer's innovative ideas. Ethan presented his concept for a chair that automatically adapted to each patient's specific needs, incorporating simple yet effective technology to make rehabilitation exercises more comfortable and efficient. "Ethan," said Natasha after hearing the presentation, "this idea could revolutionize how we do rehabilitation. Would you like to develop a prototype?" "Absolutely," Ethan replied excitedly. "I can work on this with Mr. David and the other carpenters." The adaptive chair project became Ethan's main focus in the following months. Working with David, Mrs. Margaret, who turned out to have a natural talent for finishing details, and remote guidance from Natasha, he developed a prototype that even impressed medical equipment specialists. "Mom," Ethan said one evening, showing the final chair designs to Sarah, "I think this might be my first truly important product." "My son," Sarah replied, hugging Ethan, "all your projects are important because they come from your heart. But this one is special because it will help people recover faster." Ethan's adaptive chair became an instant success when it was showcased at a medical equipment fair in Chicago. Several clinics and hospitals expressed immediate interest, and soon the factory was producing the chairs for sale nationwide. "Ethan," David said, watching the orders come in, "do you realize that at 13, you're already a successful inventor?" "Mr. David," Ethan replied humbly, "I just tried to create something that would help people. Success comes from doing the right things for the right reasons." Ethan's growing maturity impressed everyone around him. Despite all the recognition and success, he stayed grounded and was always eager to learn more, too. When the time finally came for Ethan to embark on his study trip to Russia, the entire factory community gathered for a special farewell. He would spend 6 months studying advanced design and woodworking techniques while keeping in touch through video calls. "Ethan," Sergey said on the day of departure, "you're going to Russia as a talented boy, but you'll return as a trained designer. I'm proud to be part of your journey." "Mr. Sergey," Ethan replied, "you're not just part of my journey. You completely changed its direction. I promise to live up to the faith you've placed in me." The farewell was emotional for everyone. Ethan had become a symbol of the positive transformation that had taken place in the company and the surrounding community. "My son," Sarah said, hugging Ethan at the airport, "always remember where you came from and the values your father and I tried to teach you." "I'll never forget, Mom," Ethan promised. "And when I return, I'll bring back new knowledge to help our family business grow even more." During his 6 months in Russia, Ethan stayed in constant contact with everyone back in the United States. His weekly video calls became anticipated events at the factory, where he shared his discoveries and new projects. "Everyone," Ethan said during one of his calls, "I'm learning woodworking techniques that have been used in Russia for centuries. I can't wait to come back and teach you." His enthusiasm was contagious, and everyone at the factory felt inspired by his progress and dedication. When Ethan finally returned to the United States, he brought back not only advanced technical knowledge, but also a global perspective that further enriched his projects. "Ethan," David said, examining the new designs the young man had brought from Russia, "you've come back transformed. These projects are at a professional level I've rarely seen. I learned a lot about techniques, Mr. David," replied Ethan, "but I learned even more about the importance of preserving traditions while innovating for the future." The combination of tradition and innovation became the hallmark of Ethan's projects, establishing the factory as a benchmark for both traditional furniture and advanced medical solutions. 2 years after his return from Russia, Ethan was preparing for his Industrial Design College entrance exam, with a full scholarship already secured thanks to Sergey's sponsorship. But he had made a decision that surprised everyone. "I want to study in the United States," he announced during a family meeting. "I want to stay close to our company and keep developing projects that help our community." "But Ethan," said Sarah, "the Russian universities Mr. Sergey offered are world-class." "I know, Mom," Ethan replied, "but I've realized my purpose is to create solutions for American problems, using what I learned abroad but applying it here, where I can see the direct impact of my work." Ethan's decision to stay in the United States deeply moved everyone. Sergey, upon hearing of his choice, was initially surprised, but later showed deep respect for the maturity of the decision. "Ethan chose heart over opportunity," Sergey said. "That shows true character." On the day Ethan turned 18, the company organized a special celebration, not just to mark his birthday, but to officially recognize his contributions to the company's success. "Ethan," David said during the celebration speech, "6 years ago, you walked into a meeting room and asked if we needed help. Today, I can say with certainty that you didn't just help us, you transformed us." Ethan, now a confident yet still humble young man, responded, "Mr. David, I walked into that room as a curious boy who knew how to speak Russian. Today I leave as part of a family that taught me, true success is measured by the positive difference we make in people's lives." The celebration was marked by the announcement that Ethan would officially be named Director of Design and Innovation, becoming the youngest executive in the factory's history. "And now," Sergey said, raising a toast, "we celebrate not just Ethan's birthday, but the beginning of a new era for our family business." End of story. Tell us in the comments, do you think Ethan made the right choice by deciding to stay in the United States? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this heartwarming story.